Okay, so the GitHub desktop is going to change the way it looks a little bit as you make changes, but you can find the buttons that used to be here are now here in this repository thing. So if you click view on GitHub, it's going to take you here. It looks like it's actually taking to the upstream, so I think there's a way we can change that, which is to go to repository settings. And if you see the remote is not your project, we can change that. Or actually, maybe there's a, here, maybe, wait, can we change the remote? I'll have to look at this a little bit more later, but there's a way that you'll be able to change the remote so that you're going to your own one. It might be here. When you click on here, you may see like my upstream, and then you might see your own thing here, and you want to make sure that you have your own selected. But then you can also get the show in Finder here, so if you need to find where the files are, you can do that. And you can also go back to view on GitHub. So if you need to go back to GitHub, you can do that there. But right now, what we're talking about is Godot. And so Godot should be installed on the computer. If it's not, we can install it. But usually what I do is I use the Spotlight. I just click on there and then I type in Godot. And you can just open it that way. One thing that you will want to double check, you should be fine, but if you go to Applications and find Godot here, you just want to check the version is the latest version. So 4.2.1 is the latest version.
All the Makerspace laptops should be 4.2.1.
Yeah, so they should be updated, but just so you know that that's there, you always want to make sure you're using the latest one. And so you can, if you're not, you just go to download Godot, and get the download for your platform, and just see what the latest version is there if you need to. But all of these computers should be updated. Some of you guys have your own computers, so you'll probably be downloading it for the first time maybe now. When you open up Godot, what you're going to see is something that looks like this. You may or may not have some projects here. If you're opening it for the first time, you probably won't have a project here. This is my game from my class last semester. But we can import the game, or you can open it directly. So either way is fine. If I click import here and I find my game, this is Godot's file interface, which looks a little bit different from the Finder, but it's the same thing. So I want to go back here and go to my desktop and go to my MEA 300 folder. And here's my game template. And I just want to click on the folder itself. I don't need to open the folder. And I can select this folder, and then it says import and edit. So it's going to import and it's going to open the project. So I'm going to click import and edit, and that's going to open the project in Godot. Okay. So this is what the Godot interface by default is going to look like. Mine looks a little bit different than yours, probably because the resolution of the class projector is not very large. And so mine's going to be a little bit more condensed. You're going to have a little more space, which is going to be useful. But this is good because it's easier to see things. Things are a little bit bigger on the screen. So this is what the project is going to look like when you first open it. If you start a game from scratch, it's going to look pretty much the same, except you're not going to have these folders here if you start a new game. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the interface, and then we'll get started creating a level, and you guys can play around with the level a little bit. So with the interface, actually, let me just real quick show the other way you could open the project is if we were here. The project.godot file, that's going to be the main file. If you haven't used Godot before, it might not know where to find it. So if you're on Windows, you have to go through the choose the application, and you have to find Godot on your computer. Another thing is if you're on Windows, when you download Godot, you're going to have a folder with two executables in it. One is the game engine, and one is the console, and those have to be next to each other or they won't work. So you're going to want to move the whole folder to wherever your applications folder is. If you don't see the little Godot icon, you can right click here and say open with Godot, or you can find the application through there. If there's an issue with that, we can go over it individually. But I can just double click on this project.godot once all of that stuff is set up, and it'll bring me to my project. Okay, so we'll talk quickly about the interface, and then we'll get into some basic stuff. So at the top here, I have a few buttons. There's the 2D interface, the 3D editor, the script editor, and the asset library. We'll probably go over that later, but for today, we'll mostly be in the 3D interface. This is where we can, do stuff with 3D. These buttons over here are to preview your scene or play your game. We'll use those in a little bit. This little drop down is for the rendering system. Forward Plus is the most recent Godot rendering system that has the highest quality graphics. You should be fine with that. If you notice that the project is running laggy, you might want to switch to mobile or compatibility. Mobile is kind of in the middle. It's designed to work better on mobile devices, so it doesn't use the full sort of performance of a desktop computer. Compatibility is like the least high definition graphics, so it's going to run on older computers and less advanced graphics cards. So we'll stick with Forward Plus until we get issues with that. So then there's a bunch of different windows. This is kind of the default. You can move these around. So if you want to move this over here, you can drag it like that. If you want to move it down here, you can do that. If you want to put it over here, it actually won't let you do that. But you can move these windows around. I usually leave it at the default just to keep it simple. But there you can drag and drop, and you can resize all of these windows. And this is very typical if you've used Unreal or Unity, other game engines. They mostly kind of have these same basic setup. Down here in the bottom left is the file system. This is just basically a window to the computer Finder. So if I go down here and I right click and say open in File Manager, it's going to open up to where where my projects is on the computer. So that's a good way to find stuff. One thing that you really want to be careful about is once you have this open, if you're renaming files or moving files around, you want to do it here. You do not want to do it over here because Godot keeps track of all the files you have. You can see that I actually got an error. It said I was missing level 1 because when I was playing around with stuff, I had a level 1, but I deleted it to make the basic, template. But Godot still thinks that it's there, so I probably did it wrong. But anyway, you want to move stuff around in here because Godot will notice that you're moving stuff and it'll update all the references. So you'll avoid a lot of errors and issues that way. But if you want to import stuff and dump stuff in here that's new, you can just throw it in there and Godot will see it and then you can add stuff to it. So adding stuff in here, like if I throw some objects, some models in here, some textures in here, you can just throw them in here. That's fine. The thing that you don't want to do is move, change the name, change the files that are already existing in there. That'll kind of give Godot some issues. Anyway, this is a file system. I like to keep things nice and organized, so you'll see that I have like folders for all the different parts of the game. We'll have more folders later, but right now I just have scenes, which has my player scene in it, which we'll look at in a minute. I have scripts, which has this first-person controller script. I have some textures, which are just some default textures to use, and I have materials. So again, some default materials to use. We'll probably talk about textures and materials maybe next week. For now, I'm not going to spend too much time on those. There's also a few basic files like the default environment, the icon for the game, and there's a README here, which is we don't really need, but that's for the GitHub. Anyway, that's the file system. Nice thing about Godot is all the different panels usually have this little filters thing. So if I'm looking for something and I don't see it here, I can say like, where's the player scene? I can type that into that filter box and it's going to show me where it is. So that's really useful. So that's my file system. Above here, this is the scene window or the scene hierarchy. This is going to show us everything that's in the scene, and this is what we're going to use to add components into the scene that we want in the game. So we'll use that a lot, and I'll whenever I talk about the scene hierarchy or the node tree, that's what I'm talking about, is this window right here. Import we'll probably talk about later. This big window in the middle is where you're going to do most of your clicking and moving stuff around. This is the editor window. There's a lot of stuff that we're going to have to talk about with this. There's a lot of different tools. This is the main reason you're going to want an external mouse with 3 buttons. And I'll just quickly go over. Basically, this shows you your 3D scene. The red line is the x-axis in the scene. The blue line is the z-axis, so that's like pointing towards us. And the yellow line is the y-axis, that's up and down. And to get around in the scene, we have to use all of the different mouse buttons. So if I scroll on my scroll wheel, I zoom in and out of the scene. If I click on the scroll wheel, I rotate the scene around, up and down. And then if I hold shift and I click, I pan the scene, up and down, left and right. And then if I hold the right mouse button and move around, that moves the camera as though I'm, from the camera's perspective. There's also this little gizmo here where you can align the camera view to a particular axis just by clicking on the axis. So that can be useful if you're designing, something that you want to be very precise. You can align the view and look at stuff there. And then if I click on these ones, and then I can also just wiggle. If I click on this thing and wiggle it, that'll rotate as well. So I'm using the left mouse button, but I'm clicking on this gizmo and rotating it around. This will give me different views, this little picker here. So if I say top view, I'll look at it from the top, bottom view, left. So that's similar to this one. I can also change from perspective and orthogonal cameras. That's not gonna be very obvious right now, but I'll show that in a little bit. There's a few other things, like I can say if I want to view the environment, so I can turn the environment off. That's the sort of lighting that makes the sky. I can turn that on. I can turn the gizmos off. We don't have any gizmos, so we don't see that. But and if your performance is bad, you can turn on half resolution, so it's not rendering as much. Couple other things that are useful. If I hit O, it's going to center the origin. So if I'm like over here somewhere and I hit O, it's going to bring me back to the center. And then once I have objects in the scene, if I hit F, it'll take me to wherever the selected object is. So those are some of the basics. You can also change the view here, so you can have 2 viewports. This can be really useful if you're modeling something or building something and you want to see what it looks like from different angles. So you can have, 3 or 4 viewports if you want. You can also say which gizmos you want here, view origin, view grid. So you can turn on and off most of the stuff that you can see in here. Let's see. You can turn on, well, actually, let's go over those later. So that's the edit view window. That's where obviously you'll spend a lot of time moving stuff around and looking at your scene. Over here, the inspector is where you're going to see properties of the different objects in the scene. So we don't have anything in the scene yet, so there's nothing there, but we'll see stuff get added there in just a second. So let's create a level. We'll just start designing a scene. And so this, when you first start learning 3D, there's like a few steps that go into this. It can be a little tedious, but we'll start to figure it out, and then eventually you'll get used to it, and things will move very quickly. Any questions so far? Okay, sweet. Okay, so let's start building a scene. So when we want to create a new scene, we usually start with a node. A node is just like a component in our project, and everything in Godot that we're going to add into the scene is referred to as a node. So this can be, objects in the scene, the player, NPC characters, everything is like a node. And we use this thing called the node hierarchy or the node tree to kind of say where stuff is. So our main node is going to be like our level that contains everything that's inside of it. And then certain nodes are attached to each other. For example, the player has the camera attached because the camera moves with the player. So the camera node is attached to the player node. That way, anytime the player moves, the camera moves with it. It's kind of like folders on your computer or other things like that. So we're obviously making a 3D scene. And so in Godot, 3D scenes are these little red dots. So I'm going to click on 3D scene. It's going to make this node 3D. And I'm going to call this level 1. And that's going to be the origin of our level. So I'm going to hit save. and I'm going to go to scenes. I like to keep things very, very organized. So in my scenes folder, I'm going to make a new folder called levels, and I'm going to save this as level 1. It kind of makes up a name for me here. You can just leave that. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't, the formatting is it doesn't matter that much, but as long as we recognize it. Okay, so now we have that saved on the computer, and let's just take a brief look at what that actually looks like. So I'm gonna go to my file system. I'm gonna open in File Manager. I'm not gonna edit anything, but I'm just gonna go here, and this level 1, what I'm gonna do is I can actually open this with a text editor. So I'm going to scroll down here to text edit and click open. And here's what this actually looks like. It's just a bunch of information about what's in this scene. So it's a Godot scene. Format equals 3. I'm guessing that means 3D. And then the UID, that means unique ID, is this thing. The unique ID is a way for the game engine to kind of know where everything is, where to find stuff. And then so far we only added one thing. We added a node. It's a 3D node, and it has the name level 1. So this is what that information actually looks like in the files. And we'll come back and look at this a little bit later once we've added some more stuff. So I'm going to go back to Godot. I'm going to click reload here. Okay. So once I have a node, there's a few things I can do. I can turn the node on and off with the eyeball, just like your layers in Photoshop or something like that. This node doesn't have any information in it, so it doesn't really do anything. I can also lock the node by clicking on this right here. And then I can make the node children unselectable, which doesn't make that much sense right now, but it will maybe in the future. I actually am going to lock this node because it has a position, and I don't really want that position to change. So I'm just going to go ahead and lock that node. I also don't want to accidentally click on it. That's another thing. Is if I click on this, it's going to start moving, and I don't want to accidentally click on this. If I lock it, now I can't click on it. Okay, so that will prevent me from clicking. But actually, why don't we go ahead and just look at this gizmo while we're here. So this is a 3D gizmo, and it tells us a few different things about, well, actually, it'll be better to do this with an actual thing. So let's lock this node. And so we're going to add, the first thing we're going to add to our scene is a ground. And when we're making something in the scene, everything that we put into the scene is going to be made of multiple components. And so we're going to need to organize them in different ways. And so there's lots of different things in game engines, and they do different things. And so we're often going to need like multiple different parts to one thing. So making the ground, actually has 3 separate components. So we'll talk about those. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to add a node into our level. To do this, I just click on the plus button here, or I can hit Command A. Okay, if I click on the plus button, it brings up this menu that has all of the different types of things that I can put in my game. There's lots and lots of different things. There's animation, there's audio, there's all sorts of navigation agents, there's all sorts of crazy stuff. But we're just going to start with some basic stuff. So under here in Node 3D, we have some different things. And one of the things that we're going to want to use, where is it? I actually don't see it on here, so I'm just going to type into the filter. What we're going to use is a static body 3D. Okay, so it's under collision objects. So again, the search bar is actually what I use most of the time for this, but if we go to Node 3D and go to, where is it? Where is it? Visual instance? Oh, I totally glossed over that. Okay, so yeah, then we go down to geometry instance, I guess? No. Oh no, it's right here, collision object. Okay, so under collision object, we have an area 3D. This is just like an area, so it just kind of defines an area in space. But we want to be able to hit the ground. So what we actually want here is a static body 3D. A static body 3D is basically just like an object in the scene that doesn't move, so it's not gonna, it's not gonna move anywhere, but things can run into it. So that's gonna be useful for the floor, because the floor is what's gonna keep our player from falling infinitely, into the depths. So we're gonna do a static body 3D. I can also find that by just typing static body 3D. So now we have the static body 3D, but we don't see anything, because as I mentioned, 3D objects are made up of multiple things. They're made up of the actual like visual thing, but then they're also the body itself, and those things are separate. We can run into something in a 3D virtual environment that we can't see. We can also see things that we can walk through. So we actually separate the physics of an object from the visible quality of an object. So in our static body 3D, I'm going to double click and rename this ground. In our static body 3D, we're going to have a couple different things. So I'm going to add more nodes. And so now I want to make sure to have the grounds selected when I add these nodes, because it's going to add these, whatever node I have selected, when I add a new node is going to be inside that node. So I'm going to click plus, and the first thing that I need is a mesh. So the mesh instance 3D. A mesh instance is basically just like the sort of skin or geometry that we add color to, or that we add material to, so that we can see something. So when I create a mesh instance, we still don't see it yet, but we will in a second. And then the other thing we need to add is a collision shape. So I'm going to type in collision shape, and we'll type collision shape 3D. Okay, so now we're going to take our mesh instance, and now this is when we're going to use the inspector. The first property in the inspector for the mesh instance is what type of mesh, and this is going to be a shape. So we have lots of different options here. I'm just going to use a box mesh. This is just a box, so it's like a shape with 6 flat sides. So when I click on box and click here, we see our box, and once we see our box, I'm going to click on here. And the next thing I need to add to this box is a surface material. So I'm going to click on here, and I'm just going to say, I can load one of my default materials, but let's just add a standard material. And that's just going to look like that. It's just going to look like a white box. And oh, I was zoomed way out. I was wondering why I couldn't see it, because I'm zoomed way out. There is our box. Okay, so we have a box. Yeah. Sorry? Yeah. Let me just refresh this. Actually, this is a good thing to point out in the inspector. When I make changes, you'll see this little like circle with an arrow button on it. This means like reset, essentially. So if I reset this, it gets rid of that. So I can just do that, and it'll go away. Okay, so let's add our mesh again. So we have our mesh instance. We're going to click this empty. Going to make a new box. And oh, actually, that's why. So it'll have a default surface. So we didn't really need to add the material there. Okay. So now we can see our box. And so let's go over the gizmos for a second, and then we'll make some changes here. So every object has a few properties. You can see them in this transform section. So the transform is kind of like in Photoshop. When you do a transformation, you can rotate and move and scale things. It's the same thing in 3D, but we obviously have more dimensions. We have 3 dimensions. So our transform has a position. That's the X position, and that's represented by this red arrow. So you can see when I move the arrow, this number changes. So I can move this here, or I can set it to specific values here. And so the unit is meters. So if I do 1 meter, it moves over 1 meter. If I say 10 meters, now it's over here. So if I move it with my mouse, I can, I sort of have these small increments, or I can move it along the line. I can also hold shift or maybe control. So if I hold control on the keyboard, it's going to snap to specific points in my grid. So that might be useful. Or I can just choose a number and set it right there. And then, of course, I can reset. So then we have the Y position. That's this green thing. So we can move up and down on Y, and we can set these numbers on Y. I can set it to -1, and it goes there. Somehow I just renamed this. Okay. And then I can reset. Okay, so then we have rotation. Rotation is represented by these little circles. So if I grab this red circle, I can rotate on X. If I grab this green circle, I can rotate on Y. And then if I grab this blue circle, I can rotate on Z. But again, I can just use these little sliders over here and find the right rotation that I want, or I can set those numbers in degrees. I can also just reset this. Finally, down here, we have this scale. And I don't recommend scaling stuff. What I actually recommend is setting the size of the original mesh, because when it's scaling, that hurts the performance a little bit. So typically, I won't recommend scaling. What I'd recommend is opening the mesh and changing the size here. So we can set this to 10, and it'll do that. But you can scale if you want. I can grab this blue thing. Oh, no, that's just move. Oh, I guess there's no scale gizmo. Let's see. But yeah, so I can scale here if I want to. I can scale the box up or down. And then this locks those, so I can scale just the Y, or I can scale everything together. But again, as I mentioned, avoid scaling. What you really want to do if you want to change the size of something is change the size inside the mesh. So you might forget where that is. You have to click on this mesh here, and that's where you'll see the size. So for our ground, let's make it a little bit wider. Let's make it like 30x, and let's make it 20z. So now we have a little bit of a sense of the dimensions of our ground. And it's at 0, 0, so it's going to be like centered on all of our axes, which is fine. It doesn't have to be, but that can be good. And if I'm happy with that, usually I will lock this because it's very easy to accidentally click on stuff and move it and mess up your design. And I can always unlock it if I want to make edits. So I'm going to lock this. Actually, before I lock this, one other thing. Usually the main tool that I use is this little arrow, which is for selecting stuff. And then you can also drag and do other things. But if you have something that you want to do specifically, you can use the move tool so that you only move, or the rotate tool so you only rotate, or the scale tool so you only scale. I don't really use those a lot, but they can be useful. I usually just have the arrow tool. You can also get these, I think Q, W, E, R on the keyboard are the shortcuts for those. Okay, so we've got our ground. So there's one more thing that we have to do to make sure that we actually don't fall through the ground. Right now we can just see the ground, but we can actually fall through the ground because, again, the visual and the physical are different things. So it's not like the real world where the physical existence of stuff is what makes it visible. In virtual 3D world, we separate physical and visual. So we can see this thing, but we will fall right through it if we add our player to the scene. So the way that we prevent that from happening is with a collision shape. This is what tells the game engine what the sort of shape and size of our ground is. Okay, so with my collision shape, I'm going to choose a shape. You can see the shape matches the mesh. So we're going to do a box shape. But it's the size of the cube. So we need these things to be the same for this to line up. They don't have to be. Sometimes your collision shape might be a little smaller than your mesh. Like if it's like a tree or something like that and you want to be able to walk through some of the leaves and branches but not through the trunk, your collision shape might be a different size. But for our ground, we want them to be the same size. So there's these little red dots in here that I can move around, and then I can also rotate and scale. But the thing that is confusing here, I'm going to click on this box shape, and it has a size. But one of the things you're going to notice is if I match the size to my mesh, it's not going to be the same. So remember, my mesh size is 30 by 1 by 20. My collision shape size, 30 by 1 by 20. Okay, so, oh, it is the same. I guess they changed that. You used to have to do the extents, but now it's different. Okay, never mind. That's cool. That makes it easier. All right. You used to have to basically double it, but it actually looks the same now. So I guess they changed that, which is actually good. Okay, so never mind that last bit. Okay, so now we've got a box shape, a collision shape, and a mesh that match. So if we hide our mesh, this is the floor. Again, we could have an invisible floor. You could just be standing on air. But we want to have both of these things together. Okay, so this is the basic process. I'm going to do one more quick example of a different shape. And then I'm going to give you guys some time to play around with this. Okay, so that's my ground. I'm going to lock that up. And I'm going to add maybe just a little tree. So I'm going to make a new node. I'm just going to make a default 3D node, and I'm just going to call this tree. And I'm going to put a couple parts in here. So I'll do one that's a static body. And I'll call this the trunk. And then I'll do another that's that's an area. And this will just be the leaves. So we won't collide with the leaves. Okay, so let's make our trunk first. So we have to go through the same process again. We have to make a mesh. And then make sure to click the trunk again and make a collision shape. If you do something like this, if I click the mesh and I add my collision shape to the mesh, this is not good if the collision shape is part of the mesh rather than the tree. But it's easy to fix. Just grab this and pull it up here. You can just pull these around. And if I put something like this and I get that blue square, it's going to make it part of this or part of this. And then you'll see with these arrows like what's connected to what. So just make sure that your trunk has a mesh and a collision shape. Okay, so for the trunk, we're going to start with the mesh. We're going to do a cylinder. Cylinder is like a circle that's, tall or wide. So we've got a nice tree trunk. Click on that. And we can change the size. So let's make it tall. I'm going to make it 5 tall, although it's centered. So keep that in mind. If we want this to be, fully visible, we're going to have to pull it up. However, I don't want to pull the mesh up. Another thing that's a little tricky is I want to move things by their main node, not by their individual parts. And I'll show you why in just a second. Okay, so I'll turn off my ground for a second. So I've got my mesh instance. So now, let's make a collision shape that matches this. So I'm gonna do a cylinder shape 3D. You can see the blue outline. I'm gonna click on that, and I'm just gonna match the height is 5. Okay, that looks pretty good. If I wanted to taper a little bit, I can actually do that. So I could set the top radius to 0.4. So it's going to taper a tiny bit. And then the collision doesn't really match, but that doesn't really matter that much. We're not going to notice that as a huge difference. But if you want to, we can set the radius to 0.4, and that'll match up there. But we want to keep our colliders more simple because the physics processing is a lot harder for the computer than the visual processing, at least in some cases. So we want to keep our colliders very simple. Okay, so there's our trunk. If we want to set a color for this, just to not make it look like everything else, we can click on the material, go to standard material, and then just go to albedo, which is the main color. We'll talk more about materials at some point, and I can find a nice color here for our tree trunk. Notice that everything is like inside of something else. So it's going to take you guys a while to figure out where everything is, but you will get there. Okay, so that's our trunk. Our leaves don't need a collider, so let's just add some leaves. So I'm going to add a mesh, but no collider this time. Why is this giving me an error? Oh, actually, I guess I don't want an area. Okay, let's just do a mesh. I don't want an area, actually. That's not what I want. Let's just do a mesh for the leaves. And I'll just call this leaves. Okay. So for my leaves, I'm going to do a sphere mesh. Or actually, do I have... Yeah, I'll do a sphere mesh. That's fine. And so let's set the size. So I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. With the sphere, you have a radius and height. Radius describes from the center to the outside. So if you want those to match, the height has to be twice as big. And then we actually can set the level of detail. So the radial segments, if I set this to like 16 or even like 8, you're going to kind of see less detail, which might be kind of cool. It's going to look like Mario 64. Okay, so there we go. Let's add a material and make it green. So I'll go to albedo and I'll make something green. Okay. And so now this is where I'm going to demonstrate why we don't want to move individual things. So I'm going to move my leaves up here like that. Okay. But now we've got to be careful about moving stuff. So our trunk, we can move the trunk. And notice when I move the trunk, it moves the collider and the visuals. But if I open the trunk and I click on the mesh, I can move the mesh, but I haven't actually moved that blue collider. So that's going to create a disconnect in the game. So once I set these things, usually what I'm going to do is I'm going to lock these up so that they don't move. And now I can just move the whole tree. So if I move the tree, the leaves and the trunk all stay together. So that's why I have this main node that's just a generic 3D node, so I can move all the components together so they stick together. Okay, so we've covered a lot. I'm gonna stop there and give you guys some time to play around. And actually we should, oh yeah, sorry, it's past our break time, so we should take a break as well. I'll stop there. We'll take a break for a little bit, and then I do need to cover a couple more things. But we'll do some playing around in Godot, and then we'll talk about a couple more things before we leave. Any questions or anything? Yeah. Yeah. Like creating it? Oh, yeah. Here? Yeah. Okay, so, let me turn the ground back on. Okay. Okay, so we'll pause here. We'll take a break for 20 minutes, so if you need to use the bathroom or, do whatever, we can do that. And then let me know if you have any questions, if you want me to look at anything on your computer.